Welcome to the 2022 BIPOC Perioperative Leaders to Know. My name is Carissa Brewster, staff writer for Whitman Partners, and today we have Kendall Carter, who is the Director of Nursing and Surgical Services at Boulder Community Health. Welcome, Kendall, and thank you for joining me this morning.
No, thank you guys for having me. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. So what drew you to perioperative services?
I was working as a floor nurse. I was working on the med surg unit. I'd worked there about 7 years, and I was just burnt out. I was just done with inpatient nursing, and I saw an ad in the hospital. I would check jobs at our hospital when I would get frustrated on my shift, and I saw one for a nursing internship in the OR, and I applied for it just kind of on a whim. And then actually the next day I went back to check it and it was gone, and I thought I had dreamt it all. And then I got a call. I had just applied before the posting was taken down, and I got a call a few days later for an interview. But I'd always liked, as a nurse, I got a few times to follow a patient through the OR, and I had a lot of good experiences with a lot of surgeons who were very into teaching and showing people what was happening as you were observing. And so it was always something in the back of my mind. And it just worked out that day that I saw that posting that night.
Awesome. How has the COVID pandemic impacted your approach to leadership?
I think the biggest way it's impacted my approach to leadership is it has required a lot. It's increased the amount of I guess, empathy that's needed. Really being sensitive, particularly at the height of COVID, to what everyone was going through. It was a very difficult time, because even when you weren't, even for those of people on your team or your group who weren't affected directly and they weren't getting sick, there was just so much fear, right? There was just so much worry, and we didn't know a lot in the very beginning there. Is this airborne? Is it droplet? What are the effects when you're intubating versus not intubating? And particularly in periop, it was a lot of fear, and it was being very empathetic towards what people were going through. And so I think from that point forward, it's kind of shifted that as we kind of go through the kind of great resignation here that's still ongoing in a lot of places. You have to be very empathetic to what your team is still going through, because now you're in a market where we're selling ourselves to people to come work for us, right? It's not like we have one opening and everyone's clawing to get in that opening. It's that there's openings everywhere. And so that empathy kind of carries over as you're trying to figure out what works best with you and the staff you're trying to attract.
Have you ever experienced discrimination in your career? Or have you ever witnessed it? And how was it handled?
Hey, it's interesting. In my career, very few times. Typically, it came more from patients than anyone that had an issue with race. I think probably the biggest, I don't know if I would say the biggest, I haven't really experienced that in the perioperative arena. Like, I haven't experienced that at all. In my entire career, yes. I mean, I was born in Wyoming and spent a lot of half my life growing up there, and there's it may be called the equality state, but it's not. So yes, multiple times. I think probably the biggest, I mean, if you want me to tell you a story about it, I can. Probably the biggest, most eye-opening one for me personally didn't have to do with me necessarily. I was actually going to pre-op to see a patient. I was working with a physician and a resident. There was a chief resident. So the chief resident was going over the consent with the patient. And as she was doing the consent, the patient said, "Hey, when's that?" The resident said, "Yes, I'm your resident. Here's the procedure we're doing. Dr. Peterson will be here shortly." And the patient said something along the lines of like, "Okay, when's the Peterson fella going to get here?" And the resident said, "Well, Dr. Peterson's a woman, and she'll be here shortly. I'm your resident for the case. I'm a woman also. And your anesthesiologist is Dr. So-and-so, and she's a woman also. And he said, like, if you could see the shock on his face, and he said, wow, you guys are really taking over everything. And it was just like, did he really not expect that there's female physicians in the world, or like that they were so rare you would only see one once in a blue moon or something? Because he just really never come across that. And so it just kind of highlighted for me, it's one of those interesting things where I can still be a person of color, and I deal with what I deal with in life. But there's other things where I still have a privilege of sorts that I don't deal with other things that other people deal with, right? Like, I don't deal with the things women deal with on a regular basis. So it's kind of eye-opening for me in that sense of, it just showed me kind of what other people still go through that I wouldn't be, I have a privilege of my own to kind of acknowledge and keep in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, that reaction is funny. It's like one or two people that are different from you, and all of a sudden they're taking over. And it's just
Right,
such a dramatic
right,
response.
right. It's like, no, they're just going to take care of you. They're not taking over the world. They're just
Hmm.
those, it's this fear. I had this discussion with someone else about something else in the media recently, but um, I said, it's not their fear isn't that this thing is being taken over by women. Their fear is that they're identifying more with the villain in this story, and that's what makes them scared. Their fear is like, why everyone's laughing at this character. This character is supposed to be the bad guy. That's what causes this fear in them, right? And so it is an interesting reaction to where they're taking over the world, and it's like, well, no, not really. They're just like, people just want a fair shot in the world, man. They want the same opportunities as everyone else. And so it is an interesting take that he had.
Yeah. Um, in your professional opinion, what can search firms like us, um, administration, and talent acquisition professionals, how can we promote and encourage diversity in the ORs, particularly in leadership positions?
Yeah, I think as far as firms go, I think it's just the candidates that you get sourced. I think at a certain point it becomes part of that goes back to the individual to really kind of sell themselves in a sense. But I don't know that I have a magic answer to that. Like, if I had a magic answer for what would make the world more diverse and inclusive, I'd be in a much different position as a consultant myself, making a whole lot more money. For me, though, it's just having the option to look at those candidates. That's the biggest thing. Like, for me in a director position, and me when I was in a manager role, it's really just having the option for those candidates to come across my table. And so I think ignoring everything else on the sheet, but just the points that check the requirements for the position, I think ignoring those. I mean, there's been studies, right? Where they've done resumes with two name sets, and one name set was very, very not ethnic, and one name set was very ethnic, and the resumes were the exact same, and the ethnic names did not get the callbacks that the non-ethnic ones did, right? And so I think that's what I mean by saying ignoring all those other parts and really just looking at, do they meet the requirements for the job? Then send those candidates through. I think that's the biggest thing that, like, people sourcing candidates can do to help encourage diversity. Because, to be honest, once I get the resume, I'm going to look for those same bullet points. For me, the name isn't important. It's not something I'm going to filter by. And I think for the people, unfortunately, who are in power, who would, I hate to say discriminate, because sometimes I think it's a little less devious than that. I don't know that's something that they have to fix in themselves. I don't know if that's something that a sourcing company or anyone else could do for them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, you mean just like the unconscious bias, I guess, would
Right.
be.
Like that's something that they have to actually willfully acknowledge. I think for the majority of people, I like to assume the most positive intent until people prove otherwise. And so I would assume that potentially like education, ongoing initiatives around education and other things within media to kind of explain these things, I think, and again, sometimes it's all about perspective. And so a lot of people don't realize what things may seem like to other people, I guess. I had a really great interaction once on a Press Ganey survey. And so like most of us in leadership, not huge fans of Press Ganey surveys all the time. But I had one of the points of feedback for me. I was in a manager role. There were two of us, and we had a director. And the feedback on the Press Ganey survey was, we need more diversity in leadership. To which my first response was like, okay, well, like I'm a Black dude. My co-manager is a Puerto Rican guy. Um, and our director at the time was a white guy. But what the person was saying as we got into their answer more was, our whole leadership team is men. That's where they were looking for the diversity, right? And so for me and my co-manager, our first response was, well, like we're male nurses. We're there's not a lot of us compared to the rest of the market. However, thinking about this person who gave this answer, that may be that point in nursing for her, but probably everywhere else in her life has a lot of men in leadership, right? Everything else she's dealt with is probably a lot of men. So from her perspective, we do need more diversity in that sense in our leadership pool. And so it was just something for us to consider as we move forward. And it's like something I consider now in a director position to make sure I'm keeping in mind all of the ways that all the different types of diversity can affect the people in your department and what's going on there.
Totally, totally. Yeah, I think that sometimes when people think of DEI initiatives, they kind of default to race.
Hmm.
And it's not always about race. It can be about
Right,
gender, sexual orientation, and now with trans people, it really encompasses a big bowl now. It's just kind of expanding.
right.
So yeah. What advice do you have for somebody who aspires to be a BIPOC individual that aspires to be in leadership in Periop? Like, kind of what helped you on your journey that you would pass on to someone else, kind of in a mentor like situation?
I think that there's a couple of things I found. I think I think what I would pass on primarily is when you're starting to get into leadership, I think the biggest thing you can do is to become that person in your department or area who is a default resource and a leader in your own way. Like you can become a leader because you have a title, right? You can become in a leadership position. But to actually be a leader of your group, you're someone who champions initiatives, you're someone who onboards new people and creates that welcoming environment and creates that positive culture in your department. You're someone who has peer-to-peer discussions with your peers when something happens and you think that, hey, can we talk about the case that we did today? I want to. There's some things I think that didn't go well. There's some things I would think went great, but I want to talk to you about it and see if we can make it better next time. To be that person, just because that's what leadership ends up being when you move into the actual role. As much as people expect other things, they expect that from a leader. Um, and so when you start practicing those skills and for me, looking at my team, I would already start identifying people for succession plans. It's one thing one of my directors taught me was one of the first things you should start doing is identifying your succession plan to make sure that you're leaving, when you do leave a position or place, that you have them set up in a good position, right? And so I'm going to start identifying those people based on who's doing those things. So if you're a BIPOC person who's looking at moving into leadership, start being a leader to begin with before you even get the title.
And so would that mean like, taking on extra responsibilities, doing things without being asked to do them, just kind of,
Potentially being part
yeah.
of lead unit committees, take on initiatives when we talk about, you know, hey, we're going to do this project around first case on time starts in the OR. Be one of the people who's leading with ideas and who's encouraging your team to get on board with those initiatives. You can do all of those things without a title. Like, you don't need to be in a leadership position to do those things. And that's how you become that informal leader. And that's how it makes it easy for your leaders to actually identify you beforehand as, hey, we have this potential person here. And if you have a great leader, they're going to start grooming you to become, for you to grow. When I have staff that leave to do other things, I'm not upset at them. Particular, even if it's not within our department, right? If they're, hey, I finished my degree, I took a job over in the mental health center, or I'm applying there. Hey man, let me reach out to them for you. That's great. I know you've been working on this degree the last 2 years. Let's see what we can do to help you get over there. Like, I know that that's your career path. What can I do to help you then? As I see that as part of my role, and I think any good leader does, is how do we help our team grow, even if it's not just growing within our department. And so when they can identify you from you taking on those responsibilities, it makes it a lot easier, and they're already in tune with, you would fit good in that role. If you never say anything, you never do anything, and you never show anything, no one's ever going to know anything, and you're probably not going to get those opportunities, no matter who you are.
Mm-hmm. How did you have anyone or multiple people that were mentors for you,
Mm-hmm.
and how did they impact your career?
I did. So the first time I moved into leadership, I was a staff nurse in the OR at that point. And my director at the time, we had an opening for like a service line lead, and he said, he encouraged me to go for it. And at the time I said, I don't think I really want to do that. And he said, well, the position's been open, you know, for X months, and you've been doing all these things anyway. So you've become the resource for the service line. So you can do the job and get the title and the pay for it, or you cannot and still end up doing it until it gets filled. But he said, I think you'd be good at it and you should give it a shot. And that's how I ended up moving into that role. And then from there, it was just at that point, it was something I enjoyed doing. So it was just looking at more growth. But I think the biggest way he impacted me, probably the biggest impact, is when I had multiple different directors who just had very different styles. And so seeing their different styles and being able to pick and choose the parts of them I like the most, and then just implement, like, I could make my own kind of practice with all of those parts and pieces versus kind of being a mirror of one or the other. And so I think that was the biggest part about having those mentors for me. I think the initial one, he was also a great resource. So that made it easy for me to transition into leadership, because I could go to him with things and it was never like a judgmental conversation.
Yeah.
It was very much in all of our discussions with our discussions wouldn't be, you need to do this. It would be, what do you think you should do? And then it would be how he could support me doing that thing. And so that helped build my confidence there, right? Because it wasn't, I'm just doing what I'm told. It was, I want to do this. Here's how he's helped me understand I can move this plan forward, which helped build my confidence in my practice there.
Mm-hmm. And like, what are 3 key areas you think a mentor should cover? So you mentioned about how your mentor, how he approached that by doing things that helped you build your confidence. So like, what are kind of 3 areas you think are important?
I think definitely one is helping build that confidence in your team, particularly people who are new to leadership, because that's a tough transition to go from buddy to boss. And so I think building that confidence with them. And I think the second big thing is helping them understand the picture that they need to look at now. And what I mean by that is, I always liken leadership to levels. And so I liken our frontline staff to people on the street who just witnessed an accident and are Service line leads are the window washer. They can see the accident, but they can see a little more around it. And as you keep going up to the CEO up in the satellite, like they all have different views, and all those views are important. But when you move into leadership, you have to understand how your view has changed. You have other things to take into account now. And so I think that's the second portion, is making sure, helping them understand that view. I find in healthcare, particularly in periop, that's a difficult transition for people to make sometimes, because they're used to being the frontline person who's a peer, and now they're a leader who's got a little bit more encompassing role. And so they need help seeing that perspective. So I would say that would be the other thing. For the third thing, as a mentor, is having that safe and open line of communication. I need my team to feel like we can have a safe discussion. That doesn't mean we'll always agree. That doesn't mean that there's not times where I, as a leader, will say, I hear everything you're saying, but we're gonna go with this plan. Like some things are an executive decisions, that it's not necessarily a democracy in the workplace. But being able to bring forth a different opinion or bring forth a question. I never want my team to be afraid to ask me a question. And so I think making sure that you have that, you can have multiple communication styles as long as people feel that they're able to have that safe conversation with you, that they're going to be treated with respect and value. That's probably my biggest thing overall through multiple arenas I harp on, is respect and value within your team and your workplace. And so that would probably be the three, I would say.
What are your thoughts on how people can handle, you know, politics leaking into the workplace? I mean, this is something I think we've been dealing with the last several years. It really wasn't quite the case, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So we might be hitting a peak with this, but like, how do people handle this gracefully?
To be honest, I handle it. I typically handle it very bluntly when that starts to come up. And I say, what I say to people is, there's two things that you can always make sure you stay out of trouble in the workplace if you stay away from them in your discussion, and it's religion and it's politics. And so if you're, and I will say that when I come across my team, and yes, you may hear two people discussing their love for a certain candidate or policy or something, and certain ones who don't. And what I will say to them is, guys, this isn't the place. Like, is it politics? Is it religion? Then you need to do that. That needs to be a private conversation between the two of you. Like here, like in the OR at the control desk, is not the place for that. Whether we agree, I mean, it gets difficult because there's some tough issues in politics today, that it's very hard not to say something. What I tell people a lot of times is, people will use the term getting political now. This is probably my pet peeve, one of them, but they'll use the term getting political as almost as an escape button, right? And so, like, oftentimes I'll hear this when people talk about Black Lives Matter, right? And they'll say, like, well, let's not get political. And my response is, there's some things, if you're saying that my life having worth and value is getting political, you're saying it's up for debate. And if you're telling my life having worth and value is up for debate, then I don't, like, that tells me more about where I stand with you and how I should interact with you than anything else. Yeah, I'm not, and so that is where it gets tough, because you will catch, particularly in the operating room, there's a lot of times where staff, physicians, et cetera, there's a lot of conversation and collegial interactions that people, like, you don't see it on Grey's Anatomy, but that's what happens. It's doctors will talk about their vacation as they're operating or whatever. And so that part does get tough to really separate it. And I've had to, there's been so many times where I really want to say something and really engage someone based on, like, my belief. And I have to hold that standard the same for everyone. hey guys, well, that's probably not the best place to be talking about that subject. Let's move along to whatever. What was the score last night in the game? Um, it's just not you. It's difficult in the workplace. You want to take a stance and for your personal beliefs, but there's some things that are just not appropriate in the moment.
Yeah, yeah. Um, the nursing shortage is not new. Obviously, it's been around, or it's been people have been talking about it for a long time. What are your thoughts on how the industry can think about shoring up the pipeline?
I'm going to be honest with you. I think the industry is 2 to 3 years behind what the problem is, and I think it's interesting. I'm in an interesting demographic, I guess, because I'm one of the first generations that grew up with electronics, right? We grew up with Nintendo and Sega, and we moved into this world now where like my kids are entering high school and they've never been without an iPhone. And so we have a whole generation where if you're like I'm older but still technologically savvy. So like I see people on Twitter, I see social media on TikTok. But what I'm seeing from these younger generations is there's a very clear idea of I'm not working somewhere 10 to 15 years. I'm going to work for you maybe 2 to 3 years, and then I'm going to go somewhere else that's going to pay me more money. They've kind of figured out that that's the way the game has worked up to this point, is you have a much better chance of increasing your pay, your compensation when you take on a job versus when you stay at a job. And so the 20-year-olds coming out now, their mindset is totally, I'm going to work somewhere for maybe 2 years and then I'm going to move on to something else. And I think our industry is holding on to this idea of like, how do we retain people for 10 years? I don't know that you're going to be able to do that with the model that you have, because they understand that that's not their entire programming now is to not do that. So I honestly don't. I think it's going to take probably a huge revamp of the way that we look at and model a lot of the retention programs we do. I don't know that there is an answer. I think part of this shortage is people kind of called the system's bluff all at once. The system was never designed for this many people to resign at once. It was always designed for kind of this ebb and flow kind of trickle between the two. When you have this massive exodus of people, the system A was not designed to handle that. And B, because it was never kind of taken into account, it's now not designed to recover from that. And so I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's the market certainly is going to have to adapt to this idea of you're not going to lure people in for 10 years. They understand now that they don't have to be locked into that. And so you're really going to have to come out of the compensation pile to even come close to luring them in for that. They know that they can just leave in 2 years and go somewhere else. And they're not afraid of a contract or something.
Right. I think that people are still working off of the model, 50 years ago, where you go to your one job and you stay there for 30
Right.
years, and then you retire and they have a party and then they see you off.
Right. And they're like, they're not, like, it's interesting to see like this younger generation. And just like I said, it's interesting to see them interact across social media, and you can just see that like they're not buying into that. And so we can be stubborn in the industry and try to stick to how things have always been. And I understand that there's people don't want to move that bottom line, and potentially more compensation means less profit. I totally understand that. But again, that people like this generation, they're more power to them, because it's interesting to see them just have a mindset of like, I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. I'll go work fast food if I have to. I don't care. To like they're really set on like, I'm going to go to the place where I can get the most. And I know that if I hop between positions, particularly like in Denver, it's an interesting market. We have like 10 hospitals in a 100-mile radius or something, right? And so people can travel nurse within just the Metro Denver area with like, and just move between hospitals in Denver at this point. And so to them, it's like, why am I going to sign on permanent here, take less pay? Like, I can just keep doing this for probably the next 5 to 10 years. And we on the institution side, we don't have a good answer for that yet. Like, people haven't moved to the mindset of, we need to have a good answer for that. If we don't have a good answer for that, they're not going to stop doing that.
Right. They're just, in some ways, responding to their environment, and they're making sound decisions based off of what's happening around them.
Yeah. I tell people, like, people hate to bring the word union into anything, but what I say is these people who have all left to travel, they've almost essentially created a union without a union. They're now this group of people that you have to negotiate with, wages and otherwise. There's no real structure to it, though. It's just like you're doing it person by person, but you're now stuck. Like, you don't have another option. You can't bring in new staff and new people fast enough from like new grads to replace your openings. So you're stuck dealing with this nebulous group of travelers out here, and it's just not a great place for you to be as an organization either way. So I think that the organizations that really do adapt early are going to see the biggest gains, potentially as everyone continues to rebuild.
And so thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.